Hi guys, Squirrel here and welcome to episode 6 of my tutorial series on Microsoft Flight Simulator. Now the episodes in this series are built on the previous one, so if you've not watched the other episodes, I strongly suggest you do that. The goal of this episode is stable flight. That is, we're going to discuss and show you and get you to set up an aircraft for stable climbs, stable flight and stable descent. Very, very important topic. In order to take part in this, you'll need to spawn yourself in a Cessna 152. This is the basic Cessna 152, not the Aerobat, and spawn at Renton, KRNT, Kilo Romeo November Tango. I'm on runway 34 at Renton. Just set the weather to clear skies and the time to midday, and then we can go through stuff. Right, so let's get in the cockpit. And here we are in the cockpit of the Cessna 152. Now, the stuff we're going to learn today is essentially principles of flying. They apply to all aircraft. However, every aircraft is different and they kind of lay things out a bit differently. We're going to go through the Cessna 152 specifically, which is why I've asked you to jump into this aircraft so I can show you exactly where everything is. Now, what I suggest you do is you get rid of these yokes here. They'll just make life a little bit easier in terms of visibility, because we're going to pay attention to this little thing down here quite a bit today, which is the elevator trim. The elevator trim in real life is something that you reach down with your right hand and use, and it is used to trim the elevator, hence the name elevator trim. What the heck is the elevator, you might be asking? Well, the elevator is this thing right on the back of the aircraft here. If I pull the stick back, you'll see it pitches up, and if I push the nose down, it pitches down. And it quite literally controls the elevator pitch of the aircraft. So if I pull back, what will happen is the nose of the aircraft will come up, and if I push it down, the nose of the aircraft will go down. What the trim does is it acts a little bit like, think of it like a third hand. So instead of, say, I'll just put the yoke back for a second, instead of having to like hold the yoke back in this position, what I can basically do is manipulate the elevator. See that marker there? So it goes nose up, and it will effectively hold it in that position. It doesn't really hold it in that position. It's a bit more complicated than that, but think of it that way. If you get this trim set properly, you'll be able to take your hand off the control and you won't have to pull back anymore. That's what it does. How it does it is for another time. What I want you to do for now though is two things. One, make sure that you've got a control map to it so you can see I can manipulate it with a button on my stick. And two, just make sure that the takeoff position there is set for the elevator. Right, so one other thing before we get going here, if I just zoom into the instruments, we're going to focus today on, well, the main focus today is going to be this, the airspeed and the altitude. These are our two primary instruments that we're going to be looking at and the effect that we can have on them. We're also going to be looking at the attitude indicator and the vertical speed briefly. This one is always important. You always need to know the attitude of your aircraft. But what we're going to talk about is the relationship between power, elevator, airspeed and altitude. We're going to look at the relationship between these things. First thing we need though is to have an accurate altimeter. So just press the B key on your keyboard and that will reset the pressure reading, if you like, on the altimeter so it reads an accurate altitude. I'll discuss one day in a later tutorial how that all works, but don't worry about it for now, just press the B key. So what I want you to do now is just release the parking brake, apply full power, keep the aircraft centered down the runway, and just pull yourself into a climb and take off. Get a nice steady climb going and get yourself up to about 2,000 feet. So the airspeed picks up that top left instrument. It gets to about 50 knots. I'm going to start pulling back slightly and the aircraft's nose will just begin to rise. And just keep pulling back. Anything around 70 knots will do. Don't worry about particular climb speed right now. 70 knots will get you a decent climb. Make sure you bring the flaps up just in case they were set. So press your flaps up button. As you can see, mine was set because I'm picking up speed. And then just pitch the aircraft up and hold about 70 knots. So now will be a decent enough time to discuss trim, because right now I am pulling back on this stick. Put the stick back, you can probably see that I'm basically holding it in a back position just to keep that speed at 70 with full power. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to manipulate the trim. So watch the position of the trim. And if you pull the nose, so it says nose down, so pull back on the trim, you'll see the wheel will go from a top to a down position, and get it into a position where you can basically just let go of the stick and it will climb at 70. You see that's a bit too much, so I'll just bring it forward slightly. There we go. It will take a little bit of fiddling around because in a real plane you can actually feel through force feedback on the stick, you can actually feel when it's trimmed. In a sim we don't get that luxury yet, so just play around until you've got the trim set, you've got yourself about a 70 knot climb speed, and I'm not holding onto the control anymore. I literally let go of my control, and this is what they call a stable climb. The aircraft is now pitched and climbing at 70 knots. So keep climbing. Let's get ourselves to about 2,000 feet, and then we'll get ourselves into a level flight, and then we'll look at some other aspects. So climbing all the way up, still going, not holding the stick at all. Doing a bit of Seattle downtown over here. Look at this. Fantastic. Right, so we're coming up to 2,000 feet. Just little hands on the 2, big hands coming up to 0. It's 2,000 feet. And when it gets to 2,000 feet, just push the nose gently forward. So that's about 2,000 feet. Just push the nose gently forward, like that. And you can see the dial below it is now reading 0. You can see on my attitude indicator, the little orange wing is... In fact, you know what? Let me just pause this. I'm going to pause this and just show you what I mean. So, here's the attitude indicator, and this little orange wing here, this represents our wings, and this white line represents the horizon. So if we get our orange wing exactly on that white line, then we are flying level. This is the vertical speed indicator. This is telling us how quickly we're going up or how quickly we're going down. If this reads 0, we're not going up or down. We're in a stable level flight at that point. And that's what we're aiming for. We're just aiming to put the nose down slightly. So we've got these wings in the white arc. We've got about 0 here. And this should not change anymore. We're going to be flying level. So let's just unpause it. And just resettle the aircraft. Around about there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull the power back a bit. Just like that. And then make sure I stay in a level flight. And now I'm going to trim. So I'm pushing the trim wheel forward. And I'm getting it to the point, exactly like in the climb, where I can let go of the stick. And I'm neither climbing or descending. I'm basically what they call trimmed. I'm just going to pull it up slightly. There we go. So you can see the little trim wheels moving down the bottom there. It takes a little bit of practice, this, particularly in the sim as well. It takes a bit of practice, but when you've got it trimmed out, you should be reading about 0 and flying level at a certain altitude. 2,000 is good. Don't worry if you're over or under. It doesn't matter what altitude you're flying at this point. I just want you to get a feel for the elevator trim. See, if I push it with the mouse, nose goes down. If I pull it back up, nose comes up. All I was doing was manipulating a control to do that. But if I basically just level it out, there you go. And you'll notice why I'm doing this. The yoke doesn't move, because the trim tab is independent, if you like, of the elevator. It's a simple explanation. There you go. So we get rid of the yoke. And we're trimmed. Now, autopilot systems basically do this for you. They basically trim the aircraft for you, but it's important to be able to do it yourself, because you won't always be flying in an aircraft with autopilot. In fact, this one has no autopilot. So the only way to fly this for long periods is to get the plane trimmed so that you can take your hand off the stick and not have to keep pushing it forward or keep pulling it back. So here you go, we're now in what they call stable and level flight, and this is a really good first goal. If you can take your plane off, get yourself flying at a given altitude like this, just go for about 2000 RPM. It is a nice starting point, 2000 RPM on the throttle. Just move the throttle forward and backwards so you get to 2000. You should be doing, in this plane, you should be doing about 80 knots if you're level flight. About 80 knots is what we're doing. If you can get to this point, then well done. You've basically got yourself trimmed, and this is an important starting point. Now for another important concept. While we're sat here in a little cruise here, we're all nice and comfortable, let's talk about another concept: speed, airspeed. In a car, if you want to go faster, you put your foot on the accelerator, and if you let go of the accelerator, you'll slow down. It's not quite that simple in a plane. That's not how it works. In a plane, the throttle controls your altitude, and the pitch of the aircraft controls the airspeed. So if I want to go faster or slower, I need to pitch the aircraft to do it. So let's demonstrate that. I'll put the yoke back on so we can see it. I want you to watch the airspeed. I'm going to pull back on the stick. Watch what happens to the airspeed. So I've pulled back on the stick, the airspeed is coming down, our altitude is rising. I'll level it off, and then I'll push the nose down. So I push the nose down and we immediately gain speed very quickly. And I pull the nose back up again. And then try and just get it level back out at about 2000. It'll take a little while to settle down, don't worry about that. I didn't touch the throttle once then. Not once did I touch the throttle. And I changed my airspeed, I changed my altitude, and I did it all through pitching the aircraft. And that is a really important concept to understand, that if you want airspeed, and you want it now, put the nose down. If you've got too much airspeed and you need to get rid of it, you need to pull the nose back up. Now throttle is of course related to all of this, but we use the throttle in a different way. So the obvious next question is, well, what happens if I push or pull the throttle? What happens then? What happens to my airspeed? What happens to my altitude? Well, watch what happens. So at the moment we're on 2000 RPM. I'm going to give it full throttle, which will of course put the RPM up. But what will happen is the aircraft will go into a climb. It will pitch up, it will go into a climb, and then our airspeed will actually start to come back and our RPM will come back. So watch this, I'm going to go full throttle and I'm not going to touch the yoke. RPM's coming up, airspeed's starting to build. However, the aircraft is now pitching up, the altitude is rising, and the airspeed is now coming back down. And this is why you don't use throttle for speed. We've actually put the full throttle in, but we're actually going slower now. Let's just pull the throttle back to 2000 RPM. And I'll just get it leveled out again. So what actually happened there is we just gained a few hundred feet. And that's why I say that the throttle controls the altitude. It does not control speed. And it's a concept you need to get used to. Let's try it the other way. Let's pull the throttle. What do you think is going to happen? Pull the throttle. I'm not touching the stick. First of all, we slow down. Then we start to lose altitude. As we lose altitude, the aircraft is pitched down, and now we're gaining speed. The RPM is staying the same. We're losing altitude rapidly. Now the aircraft is pitching back up again. We're still losing altitude, but the aircraft speed has come back. Yet again, the throttle did not control the speed, but it did control the altitude. Let's put the power back in. Full power, nose up, and we'll get back up to 2000. And then we'll get it trimmed out again. Okay, so hopefully, if you already knew this stuff, then wonderful. If you didn't, you probably just had your mind blown. And that's great, because you just learned a very important concept about flying a plane. So how does trim factor into all of this? We know there's a relationship between the power and the pitch of the aircraft. and that affects the airspeed and the altitude. But what does trim actually do? How does it help us? Well, there's a mnemonic that you need to remember. One is PAT and one is APT. So PAT stands for power, attitude and trim. So having set the power that you want, set the attitude that you want the aircraft to be at, so that's giving you a stable climb, a stable descent, a stable flight, whatever it is, you then trim. The other one, attitude, power and descent, attitude, power and trim, is used when you're climbing. So when you climb up to a certain level, you then pitch the attitude down to get level flight, adjust the power, and then you trim. In all cases, you adjust the trim at the end. So let's try that out now. So we're in stable flight, you're all trimmed up, your hand's not on the stick at all, and the plane is basically flying itself. 2000 RPMs, 80 knots. Power, attitude, trim. We're going to climb up to 3000 feet. Put the power in, get the full power, adjust the attitude, pitch the nose up, so we're going to keep our climb speed that we set earlier to about 70 knots. So just adjust the attitude of the climb to get yourself to about 70 knots, and then I'm adjusting the trim wheel because I want the trim to basically do the pitch for me, you see. I'll pitch it down just a touch. There you go. I am now not touching the yoke, not touching the control, and you don't have to be exact about this. Just, you know, we're just trying to learn here. Just don't be exact. It's climbing at about 70 knots. It's trimmed. Full power in, and we're trimmed. So power first, attitude, you'll then get the airspeed that you want. When it's where you want for that particular attitude, trim. So we're getting up to 3000 feet. Now at 3000 feet, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to do attitude, then power, then trim. Trim is always last. Why do we do this? Well, because after a climb, the airspeed is not very high. So we adjust the attitude to get ourselves level, and then we allow the aircraft to pick up speed. And as it picks up speed, we then bring the power back to our cruise power, and then we trim. So attitude, power, trim after a climb. Let's see that in action. We're coming up to 3000. We're going to push the nose down. Attitude indicator shows that we're on about level. Vertical speed is on about 0. What will happen is now the airspeed will now start to pick up as it is, and then we just pull the power back to where we want it. We said about 2000 RPM. There's 2000 RPM. We get the attitude right, and then we trim. So the trim wheel, a little bit too much trim there. It's around about there. Don't go chasing this needle, by the way. The vertical speed indicator needle is a few seconds behind what the aircraft is actually doing. So don't try and chase this needle, you're onto a loser. What's more important really is if you've got your camera in a fixed position, and this is true in a real plane, whatever height you are when you get in the aircraft, when you're sat on the runway, look at the horizon, look at the top of the aircraft, and try to remember that kind of position, because that will tell you more about what is probably a normal attitude for cruise than anything else. You can of course look at your instruments, and you really should, but that's a really good visual reference. So we've got it trimmed out, 2000 RPM. We're doing, well, just over 80 knots because I'm actually in a slight descent now. There we go. The trim is very sensitive, by the way. There you go. So we're trimmed out again, back to our cruise, and we're up at 3000 feet this time. So that is how power, attitude, trim, and attitude, power, trim work. Okay, there's lots of stuff for you to practice here. Definitely jump in this plane, get up in the air, and try to do what I've just showed you. It's really, really important that you can fly straight and level, and also that you can climb and descend in a controlled way. Let's quickly show you descent before we do this. So I'm going to pull the power, I'm going to adjust the attitude, and I'm looking at the airspeed, and I want to get about 80 knots still. I don't want the speed to change. If my speed starts to rise too high, like this, I need to pull up slightly, because attitude is controlling the speed of the plane. So if I want to descend, at this particular speed, I just adjust the pitch of the aircraft, and then now I'm going to trim. Power, attitude, trim. So now I am not touching the stick, not touching the trim, I'm not touching the stick, and we are in a descent. The engine is idling, we're descending at the speed we want, and the altitude is coming down. When you can do this, you're one step closer to doing great landings, because now you've got a controlled descent, which is very, very important for approaches. I'm just going to put the power back in and get back up to 2000. There's one last concept I want to show you before we end this lesson. If you've followed along so far, you're doing great. If you're able to do this, you're doing fantastic. There's one thing I want to show you. What happens if I turn to the left, say, but I don't pull back on the stick? So I'm not going to adjust the pitch in any way. I'm not going to push forward. I'm not going to pull back. I am literally going to just turn. I want you to pay attention to what the aircraft does, particularly the altitude. So I'm just going to put it to a left turn. I am not pitching the aircraft in any way. We're in a left turn. What's happening? Two things. One, we're gaining airspeed rapidly, and two, we're descending rapidly. Let me just pull it back. Okay, I'm just going to get the nose back up, get some of that altitude back, get the airspeed back down, and I'll just level her off. Did you notice what happened to the attitude indicator? Basically what happened was when I turned left, we started to point down, the airspeed picked up, and the altitude dropped. And that's an important concept, because what's happening when we turn, when we roll the aircraft, we lose lift. And the aircraft has a tendency to basically go into a spiral dive. So when you make a turn, you do have to pull back slightly on the stick. And you can basically look at the attitude indicator to do it. This little dot right here, you want to keep this on the white line. Your vertical speed should be changing like hardly anything, and your altitude should stay the same. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to roll the aircraft, but I'm just going to pull back slightly. So I'm going to go into a roll, and I'm just going to pull the stick back. So I'm now applying a little bit of back pressure on the stick. If you start to descend, just pull back on the stick a little bit more. The more you roll, the more you'll descend. So let me just reduce the rate of my turn. There you go. Pull back on the stick, and there. So that is now a stable roll. We are not losing altitude. We are not gaining speed, but we are turning. And I'm doing it just by applying a little bit of back pressure. That's another one for you to try when you're up in the air. Just try this. Just get a feel for how much back pressure you need to put in order to make the turn. As you roll more, you will need more back pressure, and eventually, if you keep rolling, you'll actually need more power. This is what they call a steep turn. You'll basically need more power and more back pressure in order to not lose altitude. But anyway, that's something for another day. So go out and practice what I've shown you. Do the power, attitude, trim, and then the attitude power trim whenever you've done a climb. See how you get on, and if you can nail that one, then in the next episode we'll talk about flaps, how they're used, what they're for. They'll be very important for the next episode of that, when we put the pieces together and try to shoot a landing. That's it for this episode, guys. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe for more. Take care. Happy flying.